Hello and a warm welcome. Hello and a warm welcome to my presentation. This presentation is part of a book project in which I conceptualize security communities as emotional communities whose members recurrently come together during ritual activity to focus their attention on sacred symbols, producing a shared emotional experience, and ultimately building up a stable structure of interstate peace. I argue that security communities are constituted and stabilized through emotion norms that govern the emotional experience and expression of its members during ritual activity. In this presentation, I will outline the emotion norms of a particular emotional community, namely the transatlantic security community. I explain how NATO member states resolve their conflicts peacefully. Building on intergroup emotions theory, I examine three emotion norms: sympathy, anger, and fear. Intergroup emotions theory suggests that when a particular social identity is activated, for example, during ritual activity, individuals will experience emotions on behalf of the group, even though they may not be personally affected. I'm not suggesting that sympathy, anger, and fear are the only emotion norms of the transatlantic security community, only that these are the most relevant ones when it comes to the peaceful resolution of inter-allied conflict in a security community. The presentation will be divided into three main parts. In the first section, I offer a brief conceptualization of emotion norms. The next section introduces the emotion norm of sympathy and shows how it generates social intimacy between members of the transatlantic security community. Due to limited time, I will only focus on sympathy, only touching briefly on fear and anger in this context. In the final section, I summarize the findings. Emotion norms have been a core theme in social research that runs through many disciplines and goes by various labels, such as feeling rules, display rules, emotionology, emotional standards, or emotional conventions. In many ways, they all build on or originate from the basic idea that the social exercises emotional control over individuals. Broadly defined, emotion norms are collective expectations that govern the emotional experience and expressions of members of a particular group. Emotion norms are thus a subset of prescriptive social norms that demarcate the intensity, direction, duration, and objects of emotions appropriate in a situation. By emotion experience, I mean the emotions that individuals are obliged to feel in a specific situation. So, for example, you should feel sad at a funeral, or you shouldn't be angry with her. By emotional expressions, I mean social prescriptions about the appropriate forms of emotional display in a given context. So men shouldn't cry, or for example, you should show gratitude for receiving a gift. There's an extensive body of interdisciplinary literature and an emerging strand in IR on how to theorize and empirically analyze emotion norms. Yet none of these works specifically engages with how emotion norms contribute to interstate peace. Building on these works, I seek to offer an analytical framework for how particular emotion norms underpin interstate peace in the transatlantic security community. The primary contexts in which sympathy occurs are those in which one member is somehow in need. As one of my interview partners at NATO put it, solidarity is extremely important. We have to stick together. Solidarity is not just something rational. Solidarity is something that also includes emotionality. NATO is not just a pragmatic organization, but a community in which problems are solved in the spirit of solidarity, end of quote. So how does sympathy contribute to interstate peace in the transatlantic security community? Precisely, I suggest that the emotion norm of sympathy provides the pretext for solidarity among NATO states, activating similar scenarios of nurturance and involving an emotional script that calls for active caring for each other. I will draw on 6 assumptions for this conclusion. First, sympathy creates and reaffirms we feeling. All of my interview partners confirmed this notion. As one of them explained to me, quote, "The warm feeling of holding NATO together is key because there are so many countries with different cultures. It is the glue that makes people stick together," end of quote. Another interview partner told me, quote, "We feel like NATO, the feeling that we are one and act together, end of quote. Indeed, research has shown that if one feels sympathy for others, the desire to inflict harm is very unlikely. I suggest that by expressing sympathy, members show responsiveness and consideration for the needs of fellow members, which restrains the use of force to resolve conflicts among them. Individual sympathy entrepreneurs play a critical role here, particularly NATO Secretary General, as well as the chairs of the various NATO committees and working groups. As one of my interview partners explains, quote, sometimes feelings heat up, then the chairman has to respond to the mood, for example, by interrupting the session so that there can be no personal hostility, end of quote. Second, sympathy as a moral act involves obligation and reciprocity. There's a transactional element involved. Members of the security community have a stake in promoting sympathy transactions as an emotional way of reaching out to each other. But when they do, they also expect to be repaid in kind. This institutionalized sympathy give and take is part of the ritual activity that arguably stabilizes the security community and uplifts and energizes its members. Consider the following example given by one of my interview partners, quote, we cannot say that NATO is unemotional. There are emotional expectations. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was really astonished how China and Russia gave support to European countries and people started all asking, now we have to send China and not Germany? Then NATO woke up and started working on mutual aid and support for its allies. That was completely regulated by emotion, end of quote. Third, withholding an expression of sympathy when it is called for or refusing to return sympathy when it is warranted disrupts ritual activity and thus threatens social bonds. The appropriate emotion in this situation is anger. Anger possesses an ambivalent character. On the one hand, it can undermine or destroy social relationships. On the other hand, it can mobilize and recreate attachment to valued social bonds. This ambivalence is reflected in NATO's inter-allied conflict management. On the one hand, there's a general emphasis on anger control among NATO members, which is meant to restrain aggressive behavior. On the other hand, the emotional norm of anger emphasizes the pro-social aspect of anger. In the latter case, I suggest that in order to develop this pro-social function, members must closely follow an emotional script. First, anger against fellow members must be morally justified, which means that its underlying moral claim must result from an insufficient display or withholding of sympathy. Second, the ability to determine when and how much anger is justified involves the enactment of socially embedded ways of expressing anger that aims to reintegrate the offender back into the community. And finally, anger in the security community involves constant negotiation over legitimate power and authority, that is, who is entitled to be angry and when. Fourth, the emotional norm of sympathy mitigates a central problem in the relationship between its member states, which I call the problem of power. NATO members are at once hierarchically ranked and egalitarian in structure. On the one hand, NATO decisions are made on the basis of unanimity. On the other hand, there is a significant military power symmetry between members. So how do NATO member states resolve this contradiction? I suggest that the emotional norm of sympathy provides an important part of the answer. Sympathy provides a kind of leveling mechanism because sympathy is an emotion whose expression can be consistent both with equality and autonomy as well as with hierarchy and dependency. Mutual sympathy exchange significantly limits the ability of stronger members to exercise unrestrained power over weaker ones because sympathy emphasizes mutual responsiveness and care. Finally, sympathy defines and sharpens the moral boundaries between insiders and outsiders, so between those who deserve sympathy and those who deserve none. When security community members express sympathy, they indicate that the sympathy giver and recipient share a social bond. At the same time, sympathy expressions widen and reveal the moral gap that lies between sympathy recipients and those who are not granted that privilege. Giving and withholding sympathy thus serves as an indicator of moral worth or lack of worth. The emotional norm of fear, in this case, works to construct a collective sense of danger on the outside, thereby reinforcing the moral boundaries between insiders and outsiders. So in this presentation, I outlined a set of emotion norms: sympathy, anger, and fear. I argued that each emotion norm contributes to stabilizing the security community during inter-allied conflict by serving distinct social functions. The emotion norm of sympathy generates social intimacy. The emotion norm of fear produces social distance towards threatening outsiders. And the emotion norm of anger ensures social control. They also pointed to how sympathy, anger, and fear are interrelated and mutually reinforce each other. Anger, for example, enforces the emotion norm of sympathy when sympathy is unduly withheld. Fear works in tandem with the emotion norm of sympathy by constructing the pretext for mutual care and needing it. And sympathy, or rather its absence, provides the impetus for anger. In the end, this presentation is based on a larger theoretical framework of a current book project in which emotion norms form only one element among others. It should still give you a basic idea of what these emotion norms do within the larger framework of inter-allied conflict management among NATO members. Thank you for your attention.